Portal gun technology isn't the only thing about Rick Sanchez that is complex. We love watching him, though we seldom agree with his actions. He's too bad to be an antihero, but too good to be a villain. We'd consider him more self-involved than actually evil, but can the same be said about all of his individual actions? Hey guys, I'm Brad with Wicked Binge, and today we'll be ranking Rick Sanchez's deeds from good to evil. The rules. Alright, a couple of rules before we get started. We have broken Rick's deeds up into 3 tiers: the good, the gray, and the evil. Normally for these lists, we just focus on the best and worst, but for a character like Rick, we just couldn't help but choose a few grays as well. Although we can't cover each individual action of Rick, we tried to choose a variety of moments across his entire moral spectrum that we feel are representative of his personality overall. And of course, this should go without saying, but for all the Jerrys watching, there is a huge spoiler warning in effect. With that said, let's portal right into our list. First, we have the good. These are Rick Sanchez deeds that we believe not only contributed to the greater good, but were done for noble reasons, or whatever Rick's equivalent of noble may be. The gold medal for best Rick deeds goes to Rick getting swifty. Like with the majority of Rick's actions, we think a huge motivator for this was that it sounded fun. But this is one of the few episodes where we see Rick do something that's good for other people almost exclusively. When the Cromulans choose Earth to compete in their musical game show or risk elimination, Rick is surprisingly helpful. He knows what's going on, and his first step is to report it to the proper authorities so they can get someone qualified to deal with it. This is an informative and respectful side of Rick that we don't see often, and was a good precursor to his attitude for the entire episode. The change in the atmosphere ends up killing all the famous musicians who were at an award show, leaving the fate of the world to the songwriting skills of Rick and Morty. Rick's song, Get Swifty, is fun and catchy enough to get them through to the next round. Although Rick claims there's not enough fluid left in the gun left to grab the rest of the family and get off-world, the truth is that he easily could have saved both himself and Morty with less effort. It would not be the first time he abandoned the rest of the planet, including his daughter and granddaughter, and Jerry. But he chooses to stay and play for the fate of the Earth. And with the help of Ice-T, he's able to raise his posterior right into a win for the planet. Coming in second place and taking the silver is Rick sacrificing his own time collar to save Morty. In the first episode of Season 2, Rick, Morty, and Summer all struggle with a fragile timeline. We're not going to look too deep into how the timeline became fragile or Rick's borderline violence as he tries to make it stable again. The important thing is that all the versions of these 3 can reunite in a stable timeline if they're all wearing their special time collars. Most of the Ricks fix most of the collars, but there's one Rick that doesn't get the latch on Morty's collar repaired. Summer has already restabilized, but Rick and Morty aren't yet able to do so. With their reality collapsing and only one collar between them, Rick gives his up so that Morty can restabilize. It is only one version of Rick among many, but it proves that there are things he cares about even more than saving himself. Taking the bronze medal of Rick's best deed is Rick turning himself into the Galactic Federation. The Season 2 finale ended with a surprising, selfless deed from Rick. After the Galactic Federation ambushes him and his fellow rebels at Bird Person's wedding, he flees with Beth, Jerry, and Morty. Since Earth has been taken over by the Federation at that point, they have no choice but to flee to a different planet that will support carbon life forms. Their options prove to be underwhelming, and they end up in cramped quarters. As such, Rick overhears a conversation that the Rick family is having about him. Jerry doesn't believe that they should live in hiding their entire lives for Rick, who doesn't seem to care about them much. Beth argues that the only thing she wanted was for her father to be back in her life, and she doesn't want to let that go. It truly seems like Rick understood the strain he was putting on his loved ones, and the damage he had caused to Beth by being absent for her childhood. These moments of self-reflection are rare for him, and this was one of the biggest. He subsequently turns himself over to the Galactic Federation, bargaining for his family's safe return to Earth. The motivations for this get muddied in the Season 3 premiere. He escapes with such ease that we have to wonder if this was part of his plan all along. Since it puts more tension on Beth's relationship to Jerry, getting him out of the picture for a while, this one really did seem to work out in Rick's favor. But in the moment, and during the long break between Seasons 2 and 3, we were all a bit awed by just how selfless Rick Sanchez can be. After that is Rick giving schmeckles to Morty. When Morty gets to be in charge of his first adventure, Rick does more than his fair share of heckling. Part of it is that he's trying to win a bet. But we also think it's hard for him to play the sidekick. He's negative and less than helpful, as Morty gets them on the path to fighting giants and helping the villagers. But he makes up for it. After Morty is terribly shaken up by an assault in the bathroom, he tries to forfeit the bet so they can go home. Rick is suspicious of what happened and decides not to take the win. He helps Morty finish his adventure by giving the villagers the schmeckles he won playing cards in the tavern. The two are praised as heroes. The adventure has a happy conclusion, and Morty wins the bet. Next we have offering a very thoughtful Christmas gift to Jerry. This might not sound like anything too special, but it is truly one of Rick's most generous moments. In Season 4, Episode 5, Rick makes Jerry lighter than air, and Jerry's shoes slightly heavier than air, essentially making him buoyant. Unfortunately, Jerry loses one of his shoes and begins to float away. As soon as Beth and Rick realize what happened, they hop in the ship and try to come to Jerry's rescue. But Jerry, who's tired of everyone thinking he can't take care of himself, refuses to help. Rick then makes one of the kindest gestures of the entire series. He freezes Beth and tries to make a deal with Jerry that he can keep her frozen, come rescue him, and she'll never need to know. This is impressive for a few reasons. Most of Rick's selfless moments have to do with Morty, or at least friends or family he has more respect for. Rick has made it clear that he doesn't approve of Beth's husband, and would probably be happier if he floated away. The fact that he's willing to save Jerry at all, without considering it too much trouble, is a definite sign of growth. But the fact that he's able to acknowledge why Jerry doesn't want to be saved and is willing to give him an out makes it all the more extraordinary and out of character. Next is Anatomy Park. This is a classic example of Rick doing good for the wrong reasons. Obviously, he thinks he's going to make a profit with Anatomy Park, or he wouldn't bother. But there is a philanthropic side effect to this business venture. It comes with annual medical checkups for the man who hosts the microscopic park, Ruben. Not to assume anything, but it also seems like he's someone who could benefit from the cash flow he gets from the project. And, as Rick has pointed out, there's an educational component to the park, or there would have been had it not gotten destroyed. Patrons would have been able to learn about the body, just as Dr. Bloom and Rick would have been able to learn about microscopic park constructions. This was one of Rick's dearest projects, and it's one that had the potential to put a lot of good into the world. Next is beating up Nazis. Okay, so we don't condone violence. Beating anyone up seems like something that we want to refrain from putting in the good tier. But the episode Something Rick This Way comes, there was an entire heartwarming violence montage. Summer has just been played by someone she thought was her friend. He just happened to be the devil. Despite the fact that the episode started with Rick being unwilling to even give her a ride to work, he takes her problem personally. The montage shows them getting ripped, spending time together, and beating up Lucifer. This is followed by a short post-credit scene of them beating up even more people who are asking for it. Bullies, animal abusers, and yes, even Nazis. It's nice to see that he's using his violent tendencies to defend the weak. But we're calling it a good deed because, in his own way, he's looking out for his granddaughter too. Rounding out the tier is the action of non-C-137 Rick creating Jerry Brie. This is a selfish action, undoubtedly. Rick C-137 explains to his Morty that the Rick who came up with the idea for a Jerry daycare is now very rich. Even with our special Morty brains, we can figure out that was the intention. And Jerry Brie isn't exactly flattering to the Jerrys it watches over. In fact, the Jerry that we hope is Jerry C-137 even tries to leave because he feels like he's being patronized, which he definitely is. But even if Jerry Brie is a get-rich-quick scheme wrapped in a big insult to Beth's husbands, it does net positive good. While the motivation comes from Rick just wanting Jerry out of his adventure with Morty, he's also developed a place that will keep him safe. It's better than letting him get hurt, or worse, letting him get traumatized by adventures that he probably couldn't handle, nor would he want to in most cases. Even if it wasn't his primary motivation, the Rick who invented Jerry Brie had to know that it was, overall, better for the Jerrys. We now move into the gray. These are deeds where the good and bad cancel out each other. Sometimes Rick's motivations come into play as well, as you're about to see. Kicking off this tier is sharing the Mesix Box. We wanted to include an item like this on the list because it's so indicative of Rick's character overall. This was one of a million similar deeds that we could have included in its place. Here, Rick's family needs help with a few simple tasks before he goes. With Rick's gadgets, and most importantly, his mind, it wouldn't have taken more than a couple of minutes of minimum effort to help them all out. But he chooses a lazier option. the Mesix Box. Sharing the Mesix Box doesn't sound like a bad idea, but it's a lot of power to put into the hands of people whom he barely explains the ramifications to. Almost instantly, the plan backfires, and Jerry has a revolt of Mesix coming after him for his golf game. While Rick is just trying to help, we have to believe that he knew this was a possibility, and yet he chose to pawn his family duties off onto the Mesix anyway. Next is curing space aids, or, well, trying to. Unlike most of the moments on the list, Rick isn't actually in the scene. Beth and Jerry find an alien chained up in a secret lab under the garage. They argue about whether or not there's a potential good motive. While they're arguing, the alien breaks free and sets the record straight. It turns out that Rick is trying to cure space aids. It sounds pretty noble until it's revealed, seconds later, that he's doing it for money. Of course. Again, we run into a situation where Rick is performing a net positive deed for less than noble reasons. Only this time, it also involved holding an alien captive. Here in the middle of the list, we have creating Aberdolf Linkler. It makes sense, doesn't it? That Rick's most neutral deed would be his attempt to create something who is truly morally neutral. Of course, he does this by combining the DNA of Abraham Lincoln and Adolf Hitler. So there was already something to be desired in his methods. What he creates is Aberdolf Linkler, whom Rick then avoids like the plague. Aberdolf has conflicting beliefs about, well, everything. We know that he turns out more for the good than evil. However, he ultimately sacrifices himself to save others. Still, the good that somehow comes out from this creation is mitigated by Rick's treatment of him leading up to his death. Following that, we have getting Unity drunk. Morally, this is complex. If you look at Unity and Rick as more of a traditional couple, this was very, very wrong. Unity has important meetings to go to, and Rick shows up out of the blue and distracts them from their goals. He gets them drunk and high and uses them to satisfy his own whims. It's terrible. But they aren't a traditional couple, are they? Unity is a hive mind that is intent on incorporating everything in the world. While we see how they have made the inhabitants of one planet better, they were in the process of assimilating an entire ship crew when Rick reunited them in the first place. Rick's treatment of Unity is still not good, it's not respectful or considerate. But not helping your partner achieve their goals is more morally ambiguous when your partner's goals include world assimilation. Rounding out the gray tier, we have Rick avoids doing a 9/11. After being stranded on a planet where they're controlled by face-hugging aliens, Rick and Morty escape. They do so in glorious fashion, blasting their way out from their spaceship and causing so much chaos. There were countless casualties, tons of collateral damage, and just about every action shot you can dream of. But when they see the civilization has two towers they're practically on course to collide with already, they balk. Rick and Morty have a discussion about it and make the mature decision not to, and I quote, do a 9/11. This decision is rendered less neutral by the fact that they opt instead to do a Pearl Harbor. They may have made the right call for an instant, but seeing it amidst all the other damage they're doing definitely drags down this decision. We now move to the evil. These are the sort of deeds that make us wonder how we can ever root for Rick in the first place. Our first Rick deed for the category is ambiguous: selling weapons to an assassin. This was hard to place, because as Rick says, if you spend all day shuffling words around, you can make anything sound bad. On the surface, selling deadly weapons to a contract killer seems pretty nefarious. That's the knee-jerk reaction that both audiences and Morty seem to have. Rick would and has argued that selling weapons to talented assassin Crumbopulous Michael is morally equivalent to doing nothing. He's a well-connected and highly trained individual with a passion for killing, after all. Rick is certain that not giving him weapons wouldn't stop him from completing his missions. In his mind, it really doesn't matter if he does or not, because the outcome will be the same. Only he has more money in the version where he helps Crumbopulous. Is Rick right? Is this truly a neutral deed? The whole episode blurs the line between right and wrong. We learn that sometimes good intentions can have worse consequences than selfish ones. Morty's quest to save Crumbopulous' target results in other needless deaths and lots of suffering. But we always like to think that intentions count for something, even neutral intentions. The fact that Rick has become desensitized to the violence and his role in it doesn't mean that he's not involved. This one may seem tame, but next is stealing Morty's screenplay enthusiasm. A big arc of Season 4 was that Beth started looking out for her son more. This includes enforcing promises that Rick makes to Morty and making her father be more supportive. A great example of this was when she told him that he wasn't allowed to say anything about Morty's screenplay, which Rick was against from the beginning. So, is Rick more supportive? Yeah, at least outwardly. Inwardly, he comes up with a plan to steal Morty's enthusiasm for his own screenplay. It turns out that's surprisingly easy to do. He just takes his grandson on a heist-style adventure that beats him over the head with every thievery trope, thus proving how played out and convoluted it all is. Not only was it way more effort than just, supporting Morty, but it was cruel. Morty actually finishes the screenplay and makes it to his pitch meeting with Netflix, which is going well. This is a big deal, and is one of the first things we've seen Morty accomplish on his own. It could have been a big moment for the kid, but instead, we see him be defeated and downtrodden at the end. Perhaps the worst part is Morty doesn't even know why he feels this way about the project, or who is responsible. Following that is soul bonding with Balthroma. Okay, so the soul bonding part of this might not have technically been Rick's fault, but everything surrounding it was, and this was probably one of the worst things that happened to Morty, whether or not it was intentional. As part of the aforementioned Season 4 arc with Rick keeping his word, Rick is forced to get Morty a dragon after vaguely agreeing to do so. The entire episode he's being mean about it and generally unsupportive. He doesn't approve of the Dungeons and Dragons phase he thinks Morty's going through, and resists Morty trying to learn about the dragon culture. Morty ends up getting his dragon, Balthroma, and they are bonded by the wizard who sells him. But that's before Rick has an actual soul bond with Balthroma, who feels that Rick has the spirit and soul of a dragon. This was hard to watch. Rick thought Morty was lame for thinking Balthroma was cool, but then steals him from his grandson. He never apologizes or tries to make amends either. They have to go on a mission to rescue him, and still Rick is not being supportive. He gets irritated at Morty for being mad and frustrated that Morty is trying to better himself by solving their problem with technology from the world around them instead of Rick's usual science. It just goes to show that sometimes Rick doesn't learn his lesson. Speaking of which, next is Neutrino Bombs. This starts with the opening scene of the show and has a wider scope than you may realize. Rick Sanchez, the smartest man in the universe, seems to have a bad habit. Well, a worse habit than the drinking, drugs, promiscuity, and disregarding of consequences. He likes to get blackout drunk and make neutrino bombs. In the pilot episode of Rick and Morty, Rick pulls a sleeping Morty from his bed and drags him into the spaceship, saying that he's gonna blow up humanity. When Morty talks him out of it, he says that it was just a test. But after he passes out, Morty sees the neutrino bomb actually counting down. In a later episode, we learn that this wasn't an isolated incident. Rick has armed a series of deadly traps with neutrino bombs and points out that Morty seems too good at disarming them. Apparently, Rick doesn't even realize how often he pulls this little stunt, but it's a terrible thing to make Morty responsible for. The bronze medal of evil Rick deed goes to manipulating Beth into getting a divorce. So everything about this is skeevy and gross from the beginning. His daughter is going through a rough time and is vulnerable. Instead of trying to help her, or even speaking honestly about the problems he has with Jerry, Rick sees an opportunity. He does everything in his power to manipulate her into divorcing Jerry. It's obvious from the way he plays innocent at the start of the turmoil that he knows he's still going to be around and Jerry isn't. But it was never more clear than when, at the beginning of Season 3, Rick brags to Morty about how Jerry crossed him and Jerry is now gone. It's clear at this point he's gone mad with power and foreshadows that there were darker times for the show ahead. The silver medal of evil Rick deed goes to Cronenberging the planet. This is an episode that gets talked about a lot, but there's a good reason for that. All the way back in Season 1, Rick makes it clear that if he and Morty make it out alive, he doesn't care much for anyone else. The entire planet is turned into Cronenberg-style monsters after one of Rick's serums reacts badly with the flu virus. Although Morty owns up to his part of the blame, asking Rick to make the serum in the first place, Rick doesn't learn his lesson. He continues haphazardly making cures that continue worsening the situation, until eventually there's nothing to do but abandon ship. He finds a universe where he and Morty die at around the same time and makes Morty help him bury those bodies. Not only was this terribly selfish to the planet he ruined and abandoned, but it was clearly traumatizing to Morty, who was never quite the same afterwards. The award for the worst Rick Sanchez deed goes to creates place-saving device to teach Morty a lesson. We are back to Season 4, where there is more turmoil than ever between Rick and his grandson. He's used to having someone easier to order around. As Morty starts to wisen up to Rick's antics, he grows more critical. We actually think this says a lot about Rick's influence on him, a point that Rick either misses or is choosing to ignore. Morty gives feedback on a plan that was, at best, questionable. Rick wants him and Morty to hide in a fake pit of acid during a dangerous black market deal. Morty reluctantly goes along with the plan, which runs into a few hiccups before the teenager finally loses his patience. He has nothing but criticisms for Rick about the concept and execution of the vat of acid. There's a moment in the episode where it seems like Rick has decided to be the bigger person and let it go. Morty tries to have a heart-to-heart with him, and Rick is uncharacteristically amiable about it. He even makes a place-saving device that Morty had requested. When Morty asks how it works, Rick asks what turns out to be a trick question. Morty, do you want me to explain? Or do you want to go have some fun? Morty chooses to have fun. He has an absolute blast with the device, but he should have learned how it worked. The device operates not by manipulating time in this timeline, but by teleporting Morty through multiple similar timelines. Every time he uses the button, it melts another Morty so that he can take that Morty's place. This means that not only did Morty do all the things he believed he was undoing, he also killed a lot of versions of himself to accomplish everything. Not telling Morty about how the sadistic device operated was bad. Blaming Morty for not wanting to learn about the device was also cruel. But the operation turns downright petty when Rick offers Morty an out, only if he will hide out in a fake pit of acid. This was horrific. It was personal, and we can't think of a better example of just how cruel Rick Sanchez can be. Alright, that's it everyone. Our picks for Rick Sanchez deeds from good to evil. Was there something particularly good or evil that you were hoping to see on the list? Let us know in the comments down below, along with any other video topics you'd like to see covered. While you're down there, don't forget to like and subscribe, and as always, stay wicked.